When you were trash talking Jordan, exactly were you telling him? Do you remember?
He's overrated.
You told Jordan he's overrated.
It seemed like he had everything that I wanted. He had a famous athletic dad that he knew and he loved.
You know, Isiah Thomas played in Detroit as a native, my childhood idol.
Michael Jordan once looked at Jalen Rose and said absolutely nothing at all. That silence was the ultimate disrespect. In the world of basketball legends, being ignored is worse than being hated. It means you don't even matter enough to acknowledge. If you're feeling this story already, give this video some hype because we're about to dive into 5 brutal feuds between Jalen Rose and the greatest names in basketball history. Jalen Rose built a career on being controversial. He said things other players wouldn't dare say. He challenged the establishment. He called out the icons. But here's the thing about challenging legends, they don't always fight back. Sometimes they just dismiss you, and that's exactly what happened to Rose. 5 of the biggest names in basketball history came to view him not just as a rival, but as a serious problem. A loudmouth, a guy who talked way too much for a player who never quite reached their level. And the crazy part? Rose seemed to thrive on it. He wore the hate like a badge, but let's be real. Being hated by Michael Jordan, Grant Hill, Paul Pierce, Isiah Thomas, and Mike Krzyzewski isn't something to be proud of. It's a sign that you burned bridges you could never rebuild. Starting at number 5 is Coach Mike Krzyzewski. He's the winningest coach in all of college basketball history. He's built a dynasty at Duke that has lasted decades, but Jalen Rose managed to do something most people can't do. He made Coach K genuinely angry. The whole thing started back in the early 90s when Rose and Michigan were going up against Duke in recruiting battles. Rose and his Fab Five teammates positioned themselves as the anti-Duke. They were street. They were cool. They were the opposite of what Duke represented. But the real explosion happened in 2011 when ESPN released the Fab Five documentary. Rose executive produced it. And in that documentary, he said something that would haunt him forever. He admitted that as a recruit, he hated Duke. He said the university only recruited black players he considered Uncle Toms. Think about that for a second. Rose was using that label to describe black athletes who chose to go to Duke. He was saying they weren't authentically black because they went to an elite university. He was saying they were sellouts. Coach Krzyzewski watched that documentary and his reaction was swift and brutal. He went on ESPN radio and called Rose's comments insulting and pathetic. He said Rose was attacking the families of his players. He was questioning their integrity. Coach K pointed out that many of his black players went on to become leaders in their fields. They became coaches at Harvard and Stanford. They succeeded in life because of their Duke education. Rose didn't see it that way. To Rose, Duke was the establishment. It was everything wrong with college basketball. Coach K disagreed completely. He said Rose's logic was fundamentally flawed. He said judging people within your race based on background or school choice was wrong. It was divisive. It was exactly the kind of thinking that held people back. The rift between Rose and Coach K never healed. It became permanent because Rose had weaponized identity politics in a way that offended not just Coach K, but the players he'd labeled as Uncle Toms. Moving to number 4 is Paul Pierce. Paul Pierce is a Hall of Famer. He's a 10-time All-Star. He won an NBA championship. He's one of the greatest players in Boston Celtics history. Jalen Rose is a good player who averaged 14 points per game and never made an All-Star team. When they became colleagues at ESPN, tension was inevitable. Pierce had a championship ring. Rose had better media commentary sometimes. But Pierce had the resume. In the NBA, the resume is everything. The feud between them became public and ugly. Pierce said things like, "I destroyed Jalen Rose throughout his career." He mocked Rose on live television. He called him petty and insecure. When they got into debates about basketball, Pierce would remind Rose that his on-court accomplishments were superior. Pierce would point to his Hall of Fame induction like a trump card in every argument. Pierce had a point. His numbers against Rose were better. He averaged more points. He grabbed more rebounds. He was the better player. But Rose tried to push back by saying the gap wasn't as big as Pierce claimed. Rose would cite statistics. He would argue that Pierce exaggerated his dominance. But even Rose admitted that Pierce's resume gave him credibility Rose couldn't match. What frustrated Pierce the most was that Rose talked like he belonged in the conversation with the all-time greats. Rose was confident on camera. He was articulate. He made good points. But he was doing this while never having made an all-star team. Pierce saw arrogance. He saw a role player pretending to have the platform of a franchise cornerstone. Pierce treated Rose with a level of condescension that was sometimes shocking. He would dismiss Rose's entire career in a single sentence. He would talk over him on air. He would remind viewers that Pierce had been there and done that at the highest level, while Rose had always been a secondary player. The disrespect was rooted in accomplishment. Pierce had won at the highest level. Rose had not. And Pierce was never going to let Rose forget that difference. Number 3 is Grant Hill. This feud is different from the others because it's deeply personal. It's the one that hits hardest because it started with envy and never recovered from that foundation. When Jalen Rose and Grant Hill were coming up through college basketball, Grant Hill had everything Rose wanted. Hill came from an affluent family. His father was an NFL player. His mother was successful and connected. His household was stable. He had 2 parents who supported him. Rose, on the other hand, grew up in Detroit with an absent father. He struggled with his home situation. He had to fight for everything. When Hill chose to go to Duke and become a superstar there, Rose resented him for it. Rose admitted publicly that he was jealous of Grant Hill. He was bitter about it. He looked at Hill's life and saw everything he didn't have. Because Hill came from privilege, Rose decided that Hill wasn't authentically black. That's where the Uncle Tom label came from. Grant Hill responded with a letter published in the New York Times that was masterful. Hill didn't just defend himself. He attacked Rose's entire logic. He called Rose's thinking sad and pathetic. He said that suggesting black excellence and strong family structure were somehow sellout moves was harmful. Hill pointed out that his parents had worked hard to give him opportunities. His mother and father had sacrificed to build a good life for their family, and Rose was using that as a reason to question Hill's authenticity. Hill ended his letter with a line that must have stung. "I am proud I never lost a game against the Fab Five." That sentence says everything. It's not just about basketball, it's about hierarchy. It's about who was the better player and who had the better career. Hill was saying that Rose and his teammates never beat Duke when it mattered. Hill and his team won those matchups because Hill had won, because Hill had better career statistics, because Hill had made more all-star teams and won more accolades. Hill felt he could look down on Rose from a position of legitimate superiority. Rose had tried to bridge that gap by attacking Hill's character and background. Hill's response was to say that the gap in their on-court accomplishments was so wide that character attacks didn't matter. Hill had won. Rose had lost. That's the bottom line. The two have since tried to move past this feud. Rose attempted an apology on Twitter before the documentary came out, but Hill still views Rose as someone who prioritized a counterculture brand over respect. Hill sees Rose as someone who was willing to attack his family and his background just to make himself relevant, and that's not something you forgive quickly. That's a wound that stays open. Number 2 is Isiah Thomas. This one is heartbreaking because Isiah Thomas was Jalen Rose's hero. Growing up in Detroit, Rose worshipped Isiah. He saw Isiah as the ultimate representation of Detroit basketball excellence. Isiah was a bad boy Piston. He was tough, he was skilled, he won championships, he represented everything Rose wanted to be. And when Isiah Thomas was hired as head coach of the Indiana Pacers, the team Rose was playing for, it seemed like destiny. It seemed like Rose's childhood dream was coming true. He would finally get to play for his hero. He would finally get the mentor relationship he'd always wanted. Instead, the relationship disintegrated almost immediately. Rose has said that Isiah was dishonest with him. Rose claims that Isiah told him things wouldn't be a problem and then made things difficult. Rose said that Isiah talked to him disrespectfully in front of his teammates. Rose felt like Isiah didn't want him to succeed. He felt like Isiah was sabotaging his role on the team. The ultimate sign of disrespect came when Isiah traded Rose midseason to the Chicago Bulls in 2002. Rose was traded to the worst team in the NBA. It was the kind of trade that signals you're not wanted. It was the kind of move that says your coach has given up on you. Rose's agent at the time suggested that the trade was driven by personal grievances, that Isiah wasn't making a basketball decision. He was making a personal one. He was getting rid of Rose because he didn't like him. And for Rose, being traded by his childhood hero, being dismissed by the man he'd idolized his entire life, was a specific kind of professional pain. Rose said he didn't know him as well as he thought. That comes from deep disappointment. It comes from heroes failing you. The most brutal part is that Isiah has largely ignored Rose's complaints for over 2 decades. He hasn't engaged with Rose's narrative. He hasn't defended himself publicly. He's just been silent. In the world of basketball legends, silence is sometimes worse than any argument. It's a way of saying you're not worth my time. Number 1 is Michael Jordan. This isn't a feud between equals. This is a case of a legend of untouchable status completely dismissing a player he views as irrelevant. Rose's dislike of Michael Jordan started in his Detroit childhood. Rose was raised to hate the Chicago Bulls. The Pistons and the Bulls were enemies. The Bad Boys and his airness were locked in a battle that defined 90s basketball. Rose participated in that animosity. He rooted against Jordan his entire career. He even participated in the spirit of the infamous 1991 Pistons walk-off when they refused to shake hands with the Bulls after getting swept. At some point, Rose took his dislike to the next level. He reportedly told Michael Jordan to his face that he was overrated. Think about that. A young role player, someone who would never make an all-star team, looked at the greatest basketball player who ever lived and said, "You're overrated." Jordan's response was exactly what you'd expect from someone with his competitive fire. He took it personally, but more than that, he took it as a joke. Rose wasn't a peer. Rose wasn't anyone who mattered. Rose was just a loudmouth trying to get under the skin of someone so far above his level that the attempt was almost laughable. When Rose was later traded to the Chicago Bulls, he got to experience Jordan's ultimate disrespect up close. Jordan would come to the practice facility and completely ignore Rose. He would sign autographs for everyone else. He would talk to other players. He would acknowledge his teammates. But Rose? Jordan acted like Rose was invisible. He wouldn't speak to him for years. Rose later said, "He ain't talking to me, though." And that's the thing about Michael Jordan's disrespect. It wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational. It was cold. It was complete and utter indifference. Jordan didn't think Rose was worth his words. But here's where Rose's credibility takes a serious hit. Rose started telling a story about his time with the Wizards when Jordan was playing for Washington. Rose claimed he had about 30 points by the third quarter. He said he dunked around Jordan and talked trash on the rim. He said he got ejected late in the third quarter while on track for 50 points. It was a great story. It made Rose sound fearless. It made Rose sound like he could go toe-to-toe with the greatest player ever. But it wasn't true. Rose actually had 27 points for the entire game, not 30 in the third quarter. He was ejected in the fourth quarter, not late in the third. The play in question wasn't a dunk around Jordan. It was a shoulder bump after a Jordan layup. This fabrication is crucial because it shows exactly what the legends saw in Rose. They saw someone who would lie to make himself look better. Someone who would invent stories to bridge the gap between his actual accomplishments and his perception of himself. Jordan saw through this immediately and took action. When Rose eventually admitted that Jordan was the GOAT, it was too late. The damage was done. Jordan had already decided that Rose was a liar and a loudmouth. Rose was someone who tried to create drama where there was none. Rose was someone who invented narratives instead of accepting his place in the hierarchy. And Jordan made it clear through his silence that Rose didn't deserve his attention or respect. The thing about Jalen Rose is that he understood exactly what was happening. He knew these legends didn't respect him. He knew he'd burned bridges. He knew his attempts to challenge the establishment had backfired. But Rose also understood that being hated by the greatest names in basketball made him relevant. It kept his name in the conversation. It gave him a narrative. It made him memorable. Other players faded away and were forgotten. But Jalen Rose, the guy everyone hated, he stayed in the conversation. His feuds with Michael Jordan, Isiah Thomas, Grant Hill, Paul Pierce, and Mike Krzyzewski became part of his identity. They became part of basketball lore. Whether that's a victory or defeat depends on how you look at it all. Rose positioned himself as an outsider who refused to play by the establishment rules. He challenged the legends. He questioned their authenticity. He attacked their programs, and the legends responded by dismissing him. They showed him that in professional basketball, you can talk as much as you want, but accomplishments matter more than words. Rings matter more than narratives, and respect once lost is almost impossible to regain. Jalen Rose will always be remembered as the guy who was hated by the greatest players in basketball history. And maybe, in the end, that's enough.